Thomas Crawford had never been the kind of man to back down from a challenge. At 49 years old, he had spent his entire life working the land that had belonged to his family for generations, maintaining the farm through economic downturns, droughts, and shifting market demands. While many of his childhood friends had left for the city, seeking easier lives, Thomas had remained rooted in his small-town world, knowing there was nothing more rewarding than building something with his own hands. His farm wasn't just a business, it was his legacy. He took pride in the way the land had been passed down, each generation adding something new while preserving the essence of hard, honest labor. But not everyone saw it that way. His new neighbor, Ashley Devon, was the perfect example of someone who had never lifted a finger to build anything of value. At 35, she had made a name for herself as an aggressive real estate agent specializing in high-end luxury properties. She had an eye for status, a taste for extravagance, and a deep disdain for anything that didn't fit into her curated image of wealth and success. She had moved in a year ago, buying a massive property across the road from Thomas's farm, an estate that had once belonged to an elderly couple who had been forced to sell after taxes and medical bills drained their finances. Ashley had gutted the historic home, replacing its rustic charm with sleek, modern lines, marble surfaces, and an infinity pool that overlooked Thomas's cow pastures. From the moment she arrived, she made it clear that she considered Thomas's farm an eyesore. She had dropped hints at every opportunity, suggesting that he should consider selling, mentioning how much developers would pay for the land. "You could retire somewhere nice," she had told him once, flashing her perfectly whitened teeth as if she were doing him a favor. A man your age shouldn't have to break his back in the dirt every day. Thomas had ignored her, refusing to let her patronizing tone get under his skin. But she didn't stop. First, it was the complaints thinly veiled as concerns. The smell of the cows, the dust from the gravel road, the early morning noise when he and his workers started their day. Then came the official letter's zoning complaints, environmental concerns, even an absurd accusation that his property devalued the neighborhood. Thomas had handled it all, proving time and again that his farm was fully compliant with regulations. He had been here long before Ashley, and he wasn't going anywhere. But Ashley didn't like being ignored. Thomas first noticed something was off when he stepped outside early one morning, ready to begin his daily routine, only to find that the main entrance to his farm had been completely blocked. At first he thought it was some kind of accident, maybe a delivery truck had gotten stuck or a tree had fallen during the night. But as he walked closer, his jaw tightened. There, right in the middle of the entrance, blocking the only access point for his workers, his suppliers, and his equipment, sat a pristine white BMW X7, gleaming in the early sunlight as if it had been placed there on purpose. He stared at it for a long moment, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. Who in their right mind would park like this, fully aware that they were cutting off access to an operational farm? His eyes drifted toward Ashley's estate, the oversized windows reflecting the morning light like the polished surface of a trophy case. He could already guess who was behind this. Grumbling under his breath, Thomas made his way to her front door. It took several knocks before she finally appeared, dressed in a silky robe, holding a mimosa as if it were a delicate extension of herself. Her expression was one of practiced amusement, her lips curling in a smirk that made Thomas's hands clench into fists at his sides. "Ah, good morning, neighbor," she said breezily, taking a slow sip from her glass before glancing lazily in the direction of his farm. Something wrong. Thomas wasn't the type to lose his temper easily, but something about her tone, the sheer arrogance dripping from every syllable, made his blood pressure spike. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Move your car. Now." Ashley laughed, a light, dismissive sound that sent a jolt of irritation straight through him. "Oh, that? I'm afraid I had a little battery issue this morning. Guess it's stuck there for now." She gave an exaggerated shrug, as if she had no control over the situation. "I already called for assistance, but you know how slow these services can be." Thomas didn't believe her for a second. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated, just like everything else she did. "I've got deliveries coming in," he said, his tone firm, "and I've got workers who need to get through. I don't have time for your games." She leaned against the doorframe, tilting her head in mock sympathy. That's unfortunate. But maybe it's a sign, a little nudge from the universe. You've been so stubborn about selling, but wouldn't it be easier to just let go? Imagine waking up somewhere peaceful without all the farm smells. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if the very idea was beneath her. Thomas had heard enough. He turned on his heel without another word, walking back toward the farm, his mind already racing through possible solutions. He knew one thing for certain: he wasn't about to let her win. Ashley thought she could intimidate him, pressure him into selling by making his life as difficult as possible. But she had just made a serious mistake. By the time he reached the barn, his decision was made. He called his foreman, instructing him to bring out the fencing materials they kept in storage. If Ashley wanted to play dirty, then fine. He could be just as stubborn. But unlike her, he knew how to work with his hands, how to build something permanent. She had blocked his farm entrance? Then he would make damn sure she wouldn't be moving that car anytime soon. Thomas walked back toward the farm, his boots crunching against the gravel as his mind worked through the situation. He wasn't the type to panic, but this wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a direct challenge. Ashley wasn't just being petty, she was testing him, seeing how far she could push before he broke. He knew her type well enough: people who had never worked for anything but felt entitled to take whatever they wanted, people who thought money could replace integrity. He had seen them before, investors and developers circling like vultures whenever struggling farmers had no choice but to sell. But he wasn't struggling, and he wasn't selling. As he reached the barn, his foreman, Jake, was already waiting for him, arms crossed, his expression tense. Jake had worked for Thomas for years, a reliable man who understood the land almost as well as he did. The other workers stood nearby, murmuring amongst themselves, their eyes darting toward the entrance where the BMW still sat like a smug blockade. The morning deliveries had been delayed, the work schedule thrown off, and every minute wasted meant potential losses. "You see this bullshit?" Jake asked, jerking his head toward the car. "She just parked there? No warning, no nothing." Thomas exhaled through his nose, the anger still simmering under his calm exterior. "She claims the battery's dead." Jake let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. What's the plan, boss?" "Call a tow truck." Thomas shook his head. He had already called the sheriff's office before knocking on Ashley's door, and the response had been frustratingly predictable. Since the road leading to his property was technically not a public street, but rather a shared private easement, law enforcement had little authority to remove the vehicle. It was a civil matter, they said. He could pursue it legally, file a complaint, maybe even take it to court. But that would take time, and time was something he couldn't afford to waste. He could try getting a tow truck himself, but he knew how that would go. Ashley would accuse him of damaging her luxury car, file some kind of claim against him, and drag the whole thing into a legal mess that would cost him more than it was worth. No, he had to be smarter about this. He had to do something that wouldn't just solve the problem but would send a message. He turned to Jake, his expression hardening into quiet determination. "Get the fencing materials from storage. We're building." Jake blinked. "Building what?" Thomas glanced back at the BMW, the gears turning in his mind. A fence. There was a pause, then a slow grin spread across Jake's face as he realized what Thomas meant. He nodded and gestured for the workers to follow. Within minutes, they were hauling out the supplies: wooden posts, concrete mix, and wire fencing, all the materials they typically use for livestock enclosures. But this wasn't for the cattle. This was for something far more satisfying. Thomas took charge, marking out the area around the car, measuring the precise spacing of the posts. He wasn't just throwing up a barrier, he was making sure that once this was built, it wouldn't be easy to take down. They dug deep, setting the posts into solid ground before pouring in concrete to hold them in place. Wire fencing was stretched between them, reinforced with additional supports to ensure stability. The work went smoothly, every man on the team understanding the unspoken agreement between them. No one questioned it. They all knew what Ashley had been trying to do, and they all understood that this wasn't just about a car, it was about standing up for what was rightfully theirs. By the time the fence was complete, the sun had shifted higher in the sky, the morning giving way to a hot afternoon. Sweat clung to Thomas's back as he surveyed the finished structure. The BMW was now completely enclosed, trapped inside a sturdy, immovable barrier. The gate was padlocked, not to prevent Ashley from getting to her car, but to make sure she couldn't simply drive out without first acknowledging what she had done. Thomas took a step back, wiping his hands on his jeans, and let out a slow breath. It was done. Now all he had to do was wait. It didn't take long. Ashley's voice cut through the air like nails on a chalkboard. "What the hell is this?" Thomas turned slowly, watching as she stormed down her perfectly paved driveway, her designer sandals kicking up dust in her hurry. Her carefully styled hair was beginning to frizz under the heat, and her usual mask of smug confidence had been replaced with something far less composed panic. She stopped short when she reached the fence, gripping the wire with manicured hands as if expecting it to magically fall apart at her touch. Her eyes darted to Thomas, blazing with fury. "You built a damn cage around my car." Thomas crossed his arms over his chest, his face unreadable. "You blocked my entrance. I figured I'd keep your car safe until you decided to move it." Ashley's mouth opened and closed, her mind racing for a way to twist the situation in her favor. This is illegal. You can't just imprison someone's property." Thomas arched a brow. "Oh, but you can block a working farm's entrance? You parked on land you don't own, Ashley. That's called trespassing." She scoffed, shaking her head. "I was only going to be there for a little while. You overreacted like some lunatic. Then move it. I already told you my battery. Then call for help." Ashley faltered. She wasn't expecting him to be so direct, so unmoved by her theatrics. She had expected him to be angry, maybe even beg for her to stop interfering with his business. Instead, he had outmaneuvered her completely, turning her own pettiness into an inconvenience for her, not him. She pulled out her phone, fingers tapping furiously as she called someone. Thomas didn't bother to listen. He had made his point, and he wasn't going to waste another minute on her tantrums. He turned back to his workers, giving them new instructions to resume their daily tasks. Behind him, Ashley's voice rose in pitch as she argued with whoever was on the other end of the line. He could hear snippets of the conversation, complaints about how she needed immediate assistance, frustration over the lack of urgency. But he already knew how this would play out. Tow trucks wouldn't be in a hurry to deal with a situation like this, not in a rural town where farms and ranches took priority over entitled homeowners with luxury cars. She was stuck. Thomas didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply walked away, leaving Ashley fuming behind the fence, knowing full well that she had finally realized what it felt like to have control taken away from her. Ashley stood there for several minutes, gripping the fence so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her phone pressed against her ear as she barked demands at whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end of the line. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped furiously against the metal wiring, her frustration growing with every second that passed without a solution. Thomas had already turned his back on her, returning to work as if her presence had never been more than a passing inconvenience. The workers had followed his lead, unloading supplies, tending to the livestock, and preparing the farm for the day ahead, all while she remained rooted in place, seething at the sight of her gleaming white BMW now trapped within a sturdy, inescapable cage. She didn't leave right away. No, she lingered, pacing in front of the fence like a restless predator, her expensive sandals kicking up dust as she muttered curses under her breath. Thomas didn't give her the satisfaction of looking in her direction, but he could feel the heat of her glare burning into the back of his head. He knew people like her, people who had never been told no in their lives, who had always used manipulation, money, or sheer persistence to get their way. She wasn't going to back down quietly, and she sure as hell wasn't going to accept defeat just because she had been outmaneuvered. This wasn't over. By noon, Ashley had finally disappeared back into her house, though Thomas doubted it was because she had given up. No, she was planning something, scheming in whatever way she thought would best retaliate against him. He didn't have to wait long to find out what. That evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the farm, Thomas heard the distinct rumble of a large truck approaching. He wiped the sweat from his brow, stepping out of the barn in time to see a flatbed tow truck rolling up the road, its oversized wheels kicking up clouds of dust as it slowed near the fence. Ashley followed closely behind in another vehicle, her face smug as she stepped out, arms crossed, waiting for Thomas to react. The tow truck driver climbed down from the cab, adjusting his cap before taking a good, long look at the situation in front of him. His gaze flickered between the fully enclosed BMW and the reinforced fence, and Thomas could tell by the slight downturn of the man's mouth that he wasn't thrilled about what he was seeing. He had probably expected a simple job: pull up, hook the car, drive off. But this was something else entirely. Ashley was the first to speak. "I assume you're not going to fight this," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've had your fun, but now it's time to undo your little tantrum." Thomas remained where he was, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "You called a tow truck," he said, his voice flat, stating the obvious. Ashley's lips curled into a smirk. "That's right, and unless you plan on physically stopping this man from doing his job, I suggest you step aside." The tow truck driver cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. He wasn't here for drama, just a paycheck, and Thomas knew better than to take his frustration out on the wrong person. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the driver's. "You got paperwork for this." The man hesitated, glancing at Ashley before nodding. "She called us, said the car needed removal. I don't usually ask questions beyond that." Thomas nodded slowly. "Right, but that car's sitting on my land, and I don't recall authorizing any vehicle to be moved from my property." Ashley scoffed. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. You don't own the air around it. The fence was your little stunt, but the car is mine and I'm retrieving it." Thomas exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't seem to get it. I didn't just throw up some cheap barrier, I built a structure. A legally sound one. That means if you tear it down, you're not just taking your car, you're vandalizing my property." The tow truck driver shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the situation was far messier than he had been led to believe. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," he said carefully. "I was just called to do a job." "Then I'd think twice before touching something that ain't yours," Thomas replied, his voice calm but firm. Ashley bristled, her face turning red. "You can't be serious," she snapped. "You're going to make this a legal issue." "You made it one the second you blocked my farm," Thomas countered. "But go ahead, call the cops, call your lawyer, call whoever you want. We both know how that'll end." For a long moment, Ashley just stood there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The tow truck driver took another look at the situation, at the heavy-duty fence, at the tension radiating between the two neighbors, and finally let out a long sigh. "Yeah, I think I'm going to pass on this one," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't get paid enough for this kind of headache." With that, he climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and drove off, leaving Ashley standing alone, humiliated and fuming. Thomas didn't move. He didn't need to. He had won this round, and they both knew it. But something in the way Ashley's expression twisted into something darker, colder, more calculated told him she wasn't done yet, and he was right. The next morning, just before sunrise, Thomas was woken by a loud, clanging noise echoing across the farm. It was coming from the front entrance. He threw on his boots, grabbing a flashlight as he stepped outside, his gut already telling him something was wrong. As he neared the fence, the beam of his flashlight caught movement in the darkness: figures, dressed in dark clothing, working quickly to dismantle the fence piece by piece. Ashley had sent a crew to tear it down in the middle of the night. "Hey," Thomas bellowed, his voice cutting through the still morning air like a gunshot. The figures froze, momentarily stunned, before scrambling to grab their tools and make a run for it. But Thomas wasn't about to let them get away so easily. He charged forward, blocking their exit. One of the men, clearly not expecting resistance, stumbled backward and nearly fell. Thomas wasn't a small man, and the look in his eyes alone was enough to make them hesitate. "Why, all got exactly 10 seconds to tell me who sent you before I call the sheriff and press charges for trespassing and property destruction," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. One of them, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, muttered, "Look, man, we were just paid to remove some fencing. We didn't know it was." "I don't care what you knew," Thomas cut him off. "You're on my land, tearing down my property in the middle of the night. You really think that's going to fly?" The younger guy swallowed hard, then jerked his head toward Ashley's house. "She hired us. Said the fence was blocking access to her car and that it wasn't legal." Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction. She had overplayed her hand. Now he had proof that she had resorted to illegal tactics to get what she wanted. Ashley thought she could control the game. She had just made her biggest mistake yet. Thomas stared at the group of men in front of him, his flashlight beam casting long shadows across their faces. The younger one, the one who had spoken first, looked the most nervous, shifting from foot to foot, as if debating whether to run or stand his ground. The others were older, more seasoned, but even they weren't comfortable under Thomas's unwavering stare. He could see it in the way their shoulders stiffened, the way their hands hovered just a little too close to their tools, as if still clinging to the idea that they might finish the job before he could stop them. But they weren't going to finish anything. Not tonight. Ashley had finally pushed past the line of petty inconveniences and into outright criminal activity, and now Thomas had the proof he needed. Trespassing, destruction of property, hell, even attempted theft if you really wanted to stretch the definition. It didn't matter what excuse she had given these men. She had sent them in the dead of night, hoping he wouldn't notice until it was too late. That was enough. Tell you what Thomas said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying the kind of weight that made men think twice before arguing. "You drop those tools and walk away right now. I won't call the sheriff. You keep standing there looking like you're about to do something stupid, and I guarantee you'll regret it." The young one let out a breath of relief and took a step back. "Yeah, man, we're done. We're leaving." One of the older men hesitated, glancing toward Ashley's house, as if expecting to see her watching from the windows, but if she was there, she wasn't making herself known. After a moment, he exhaled sharply and nodded. Without another word, they gathered their things and backed away, disappearing down the dirt road, their hurried footsteps fading into the quiet of the early morning. Thomas didn't move until they were completely out of sight. Then, slowly, he turned toward the fence, scanning the damage. A few sections had been loosened, one of the support posts knocked out of place, but nothing beyond repair. She had tried to undo what he built, but she had underestimated just how much he was willing to fight for what was his. He spent the next hour securing the fence, reinforcing it where needed, double-checking every connection. He worked in silence, his thoughts focused not on what had already happened, but on what was coming next. Ashley had played her hand, and she had lost. Now it was his turn to make a move. By sunrise, he was back inside his house, pouring himself a cup of black coffee as he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, rough from sleep but still carrying the same sharpness it always had. Crawford came the greeting, no hint of a question in it. "Sheriff," Thomas said, leaning against the counter. "I need a favor." There was a pause, then the sound of shifting fabric as the sheriff sat up. "You in trouble?" "Not yet," Thomas replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "But someone's damn sure trying to put me there." A sigh, then the creak of bed springs. "I'm listening." Thomas laid it out in simple, measured words. The blocked entrance, the illegal attempt to remove his fence, the hired crew sneaking onto his land in the middle of the night. The sheriff, an old-school lawman who had been around long enough to know exactly what kind of person Ashley was, didn't interrupt. He just listened, his silence punctuated only by the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. When Thomas was finished, there was a long pause. Then, finally, the sheriff spoke. "You want me to handle this quiet, or you want me to make a show of it?" Thomas considered that for a moment. He could have the sheriff drive up, knock on Ashley's door, and make it clear that she was on thin ice. Maybe that would be enough to scare her off. But then again, Ashley wasn't the type to scare easy. If anything, she'd take it as a challenge, twisted into another power play. No, he needed something stronger, something she couldn't weasel her way out of. Make it official, he said finally. Paperwork and everything. The sheriff let out a low chuckle. All right then. I'll have someone come by later today. Just sit tight. Thomas hung up, already feeling a small weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't done yet, far from it, but at least now the law was in his corner. And that meant Ashley had just lost the one advantage she thought she had. True to his word, the sheriff sent a deputy to Thomas's farm later that afternoon. The man took statements, photographed the fence, and jotted down every detail Thomas provided, making sure everything was properly documented. By the time he was finished, he had an official report of trespassing and property damage, with Ashley Devon's name listed prominently as the person responsible for orchestrating it. She wouldn't be arrested, not yet. But it was on record now. And that was the first step toward making sure she couldn't keep pulling these stunts without consequence. But Ashley wasn't done either. Later that evening, as Thomas was finishing up work for the day, he spotted a familiar figure standing near the edge of his property. She wasn't on his land, not technically, but she was close enough that he could see the way her face twisted with barely concealed rage. You really called the cops on me, she demanded, arms crossed. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag, unconcerned. I warned you, Ashley scoffed. You think this scares me? No, Thomas admitted, stepping closer. But it sure as hell makes things harder for you, doesn't it? She glared at him, jaw tight. For the first time since this whole mess started, he could see something new in her expression, not just anger, but uncertainty. She wasn't used to losing control of a situation. She wasn't used to people standing up to her, and Thomas had a feeling she had never met someone quite like him before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ashley let out a bitter laugh and shook her head. This isn't over. Thomas didn't flinch. Yeah, it is. You just don't know it yet. She turned on her heel and walked away, her expensive heels kicking up dust as she retreated toward her pristine estate. Thomas watched her go, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He had won this battle, but he knew damn well the war wasn't over yet. Thomas had dealt with difficult people before. Stubborn clients who didn't want to pay for work they'd already agreed to, entitled inspectors who thought their clipboard gave them some kind of authority over the land, even the occasional developer who tried to snake his way into the community with promises of progress that only ever seemed to benefit their own pockets. But none of them had been quite like Ashley Devon. She wasn't just arrogant, she was relentless. The kind of person who didn't care about right or wrong, only about winning, no matter the cost. She had left their last confrontation angry, but Thomas had seen something else in her expression: hesitation. A moment of doubt, like she was finally starting to realize that her usual tactics weren't working. He had hoped, maybe foolishly, that she'd take the hint and back off, that she'd cut her losses and move on. But people like Ashley didn't know how to lose. They just found new ways to cheat the game. 2 days passed in uneasy silence. Thomas kept working, his routine unchanged, but there was an itch at the back of his mind, a sense of waiting. He knew something was coming, but he didn't know what, not yet. Then, on the third morning, he stepped outside and felt it immediately, that kind of unnatural stillness that told him something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The sky was clear, the air crisp, the cows grazing peacefully in the fields. But as he walked toward the barn, his eyes flicked toward the road leading up to his property, and that's when he saw it. A brand new steel gate, installed overnight, completely blocking the entrance. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his pulse ticking up a notch. His first thought was that someone had made a mistake, that maybe the county had finally gotten around to one of their half-baked infrastructure projects and put the gate up without realizing it was private land. But as he walked closer, that hopeful assumption crumbled. The gate wasn't some rushed government job. It was deliberate, sturdy, reinforced, and complete with a high-end electronic keypad lock. And that meant only one thing: Ashley. His jaw tightened as he approached, running a hand along the cool metal. It wasn't just locked, it was bolted into the ground, thick steel posts sunk deep into the dirt, meant to stay. This wasn't something that had been thrown together overnight by some half-competent workers. This was planned, probably weeks in advance, waiting for the right moment to be set into place. He took a slow breath, forcing down the immediate surge of frustration. This was a move designed to provoke, to put him on the defensive. Ashley was trying to take back control, trying to show him that she still had the power to make his life difficult. But she had made a mistake. She had left a paper trail. He pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. He kept it short, just the fact someone had illegally installed a barrier on a private road, blocking access to an operational farm. There was a pause, then a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Devon, the sheriff asked, already knowing the answer. Who else? Thomas muttered. I'll send someone, the sheriff said, his tone resigned. Sit tight. Thomas didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, a patrol car rolled up, the deputy inside stepping out with a clipboard in one hand and an unimpressed expression on his face. He gave the gate a quick once-over before turning to Thomas. She give you any kind of warning before putting this up? Thomas shook his head. Not a damn word. The deputy let out a slow breath and flipped through his notes. I'll need to verify some records, but from what I can tell, this is your land, which means she's trespassing by installing this here. But if she claims she has legal grounds, this could turn into a mess of paperwork. Thomas exhaled through his nose, already knowing where this was going. Ashley wasn't just banking on making his life difficult. She was trying to tie him up in bureaucracy, drown him in legal headaches until he either gave up or made a mistake. The deputy rubbed the back of his neck. You want my advice? File a formal complaint. Get a judge to issue a removal order. It'll take a few weeks, maybe longer, but that way when she tries to fight it, she won't have a leg to stand on. Weeks, maybe longer. That was exactly what Ashley was counting on. Thomas stared at the gate for a long moment, considering his options. Then, finally, he nodded. I'll handle it. But he wasn't going to wait. That night, as the sky darkened and the last bit of light faded beyond the horizon, Thomas returned to the gate. He wasn't reckless. He knew better than to go at it in broad daylight, where Ashley could pull out her phone and start screaming about destruction of property, like she was some kind of innocent victim. No, this was about reclaiming what was his. The first step was simple. He set up motion-activated floodlights, pointed directly at the gate, bright enough to blind anyone who approached. Then, using the same heavy-duty tools he kept for fencing work, he started removing the bolts anchoring the steel posts into the ground. It wasn't easy. Ashley had spared no expense, using industrial-grade materials, but Thomas had spent his entire life working with his hands. He knew how to break something down as efficiently as he could build it up. By the time he was finished, the gate was still standing, but it was no longer secured. The next time someone tried to use it, it would collapse under its own weight. And sure enough, the next morning, as he sat drinking his coffee on the porch, he heard the sound of metal crashing against the ground. Ashley's scream followed seconds later. Thomas let out a slow, satisfied breath before standing up, stretching as if he had just woken from a peaceful nap. By the time he reached the entrance, Ashley was already there, her face twisted in rage, her phone gripped so tightly in her manicured hand that her knuckles had gone pale. You think this is funny? She shrieked. You destroyed private property. Thomas looked at the falling gate, then back at her. Looks like whoever installed it didn't do a good job, he said, voice calm. Maybe you should ask for a refund. Ashley's nostrils flared. You think this is over? I think, Thomas said, stepping closer, that you should start thinking real hard about how much deeper you want to dig yourself into this hole. Ashley's jaw clenched, but this time she didn't have a quick comeback. She just stood there, eyes burning with fury, before finally turning and storming back toward her house. Thomas didn't watch her go. He had already won this round. But something in his gut told him she wasn't done yet. She was desperate now. And desperate people always made mistakes. Thomas had expected Ashley to retaliate after the gate incident, but even he was surprised by how quickly she moved. Less than 24 hours after she stormed back into her house, he received a notice of legal action, a formal cease and desist letter, claiming that he had engaged in destruction of property, harassment, and deliberate intimidation. The wording was professional, carefully crafted, undoubtedly prepared by one of the overpriced lawyers she kept on retainer. The letter demanded that he cease all interference with her access to her property and threatened a lawsuit seeking damages if he continued to obstruct her in any way. Thomas read it twice, his lips pressing into a hard line. It was a desperate move, a last-ditch attempt to turn the narrative in her favor. She wasn't just trying to intimidate him, she was trying to bury him in legal trouble, knowing full well that the time and money required to fight a lawsuit could be enough to force him to settle or give in. But Ashley had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated just how prepared he was. Instead of panicking or rushing to respond, Thomas took his time. He drove into town, met with his own lawyer, a man named David Nash, who had been handling property disputes in the county for over 2 decades. David read through the letter with a slow, measured expression, then let out a short chuckle and shook his head. "She's reaching," he said simply, tossing the papers onto his desk. "None of this will hold up in court." Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're sure?" David nodded. "She's claiming destruction of property, but the gate was illegally installed on your land. The moment she put it up without your consent, she forfeited any right to call it hers. As for harassment, that's laughable. You haven't set foot on her property. You haven't engaged with her beyond what was necessary to protect your rights, and if anything, she's the one who has been escalating this." Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the tightness in his chest ease. "So what's our next move?" David leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something sharp and knowing. "We go on the offensive." And that was exactly what they did. By the next morning, Ashley received her own legal notice of formal complaint, citing trespassing, illegal construction on private property, and interference with the business operation. Attached to the complaint was a detailed list of violations, including timestamps, witness statements, and photographic evidence of every single time she had crossed the line. It wasn't just a counterattack, it was a checkmate. Ashley had been so focused on making Thomas look like the aggressor that she hadn't realized she had left herself wide open. She had assumed he would fight her on her terms, reacting to her provocations, getting caught up in her game. But now, the fight had shifted into a legal arena where facts, not theatrics, determined the outcome. The moment she received the papers, she snapped. That afternoon, as Thomas was finishing up repairs on one of the farm's irrigation lines, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching against gravel, fast and uneven, like someone marching with purpose. He straightened just as Ashley came storming toward him, her face twisted in fury, her phone clutched in one shaking hand. "You think you can threaten me?" she hissed, shoving the papers toward his chest. "You think this is going to scare me?" Thomas didn't flinch, didn't even look at the documents. His voice was calm when he spoke. "It's not a threat. It's a response." Ashley let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You're delusional if you think this is going to work. I have lawyers who will tell you exactly what mine did." Thomas interrupted, leveling his gaze at her. "That you've already lost." Her jaw clenched so hard he could see the muscles twitching beneath her skin. "I am not losing to some washed-up farmer who refuses to get with the times." Thomas exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "That's your problem, Ashley. You think this is about winning. It's not. It's about knowing when you're wrong. And you crossed the line." Ashley's breathing was uneven now, her nails digging into the papers she was still clutching. She was unraveling, her carefully constructed image of control falling apart in real time. Then, before he could say another word, she did something he hadn't expected. She threw her phone at him. It was a wild, desperate move, and it missed by several inches, clattering uselessly onto the ground at his feet. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that 2 of his farmhands had just stepped out of the barn and seen everything. There was a long, stunned silence. Ashley's face paled as she realized what she had just done, as she looked from the phone to the 2 men now watching with wide, surprised eyes. Thomas bent down slowly, picking up the device and holding it out to her. His voice was quiet but firm. "You should leave now." Ashley didn't move at first. She just stood there, her breath coming in sharp, angry bursts, her mind desperately searching for a way to regain control. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Without another word, she snatched the phone from his hand and turned on her heel, walking away as fast as she could without outright running. Thomas didn't watch her go. He didn't need to, because he already knew this was the beginning of the end. Ashley didn't leave her house for 2 days after their last confrontation. The once arrogant woman who had strutted across her property with a glass of wine in one hand and a superiority complex in the other was now completely absent, her pristine estate eerily quiet. There were no landscapers tending to the imported hedges, no delivery trucks bringing in overpriced home decor, no sign of life beyond the drawn curtains of her massive windows. Thomas wasn't naive enough to think she had simply given up. People like Ashley didn't know how to accept defeat gracefully. She was plotting, trying to figure out a way to slip out of the mess she had created without losing face. But for the first time since this whole battle started, she had no winning moves left. The lawsuit was moving forward. His legal team had compiled a devastating amount of evidence against her: witness statements, photos, records of every single infraction she had committed. It was airtight, the kind of case that couldn't be dismissed with money or influence. The sheriff had already issued an official warning, and if she tried one more stunt, it wouldn't just be a civil matter anymore. It would be criminal. The real turning point came on the third morning when Thomas, sipping his coffee on the porch as the sun rose, spotted a black SUV pulling into Ashley's driveway. It wasn't her usual rental service or one of her investor buddies. It was a forensic accountant someone Thomas's lawyer had quietly recommended to local officials after catching wind of financial inconsistencies in Ashley's dealings. She must have known what was coming, because less than an hour later her front door swung open, and she stormed outside, her phone pressed against her ear, pacing furiously as she barked into the receiver. Thomas couldn't hear what she was saying, but he didn't need to. She was panicking. By noon, the cracks in her empire became visible for everyone to see. Calls started coming in from her contractors, her real estate associates, even her bank, each one more urgent than the last. She was losing control, and for the first time in her life, there was nothing she could do about it. By the end of the week, the for sale sign was up in front of her house. Thomas wasn't surprised, but that didn't mean he wasn't satisfied. It wasn't just about winning, it was about restoring order, about proving that no amount of money or manipulation could strip a man of what was rightfully his. Ashley had spent months trying to bulldoze him out of his own land, but in the end she was the one forced to pack up and leave. The day of her departure was as dramatic as expected. A team of movers arrived early in the morning, hauling out furniture, designer clothes, and gaudy decorations while Ashley supervised with the same icy demeanor she had always carried. But Thomas could see it for what it really was: a mask. As the last truck pulled out of the driveway, Ashley stood for a moment at the edge of her property, staring at the farm across the road. Then, as if finally conceding to the reality she had refused to accept for so long, she turned to Thomas, who had been standing by the fence, watching silently. For a brief second, it looked like she might say something. Some final jab, some bitter insult to make herself feel like she still had the upper hand. But the words never came. Instead, she let out a short, humorless laugh, shook her head, and climbed into her car without another glance back. The moment she was gone, it was like a weight had been lifted off the entire property. The workers, who had been tense for months, finally relaxed, chatting more freely as they got back to their routine. The sheriff stopped by later that evening, leaning against his cruiser as he gave Thomas a knowing nod. "Looks like you outlasted her," he said. Thomas exhaled, feeling the full reality of what had happened settle into his bones. "Looks like." The sheriff chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and I gotta say you handled this better than half the people I've seen try to fight these battles. Most folks either back down or lose their temper and do something stupid." Thomas smirked slightly, looking out over his land. "I've worked too damn hard to lose what's mine." The sheriff nodded, pushing himself off the car. "Well, consider this one closed, but if she ever tries anything again—" "She won't," Thomas interrupted. "She's done." And he meant it. Ashley Devon was the kind of person who never stayed where she lost. She would move on, try to rebuild somewhere else, start fresh with a new facade, new connections, new people to manipulate. But she would never return here. She had lost. And she knew it. A week passed, then two. The tension that had lingered for so long finally evaporated, replaced with the quiet, steady rhythm of farm life. No more ridiculous complaints, no more interference, no more battles over things that never should have been battles in the first place. The land, his land, was finally at peace again. And Thomas? He was still standing,